Bring those back up. That's when it can be-
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of Critical Issues Summit. We hope you all enjoying our Zoom conference this year. Certainly it's been enjoyable for us to put on, and Lauren, who's done a fabulous job. With her prizes that have been given out, so we've given out several prizes. Kenneth Marcel with Warden Smith won Milwaukee Tools. Paul Kaderi with the McGinnis Brothers won Baum Environmental. Christina Hawthorne with Radcliffe Construction won a prize from Core Occupational Medicine. More prizes will be given out today. Be sure to register on the website. So our first session is this morning will be legislative update. Before we begin that, that's 8:30 to 9:30. I'm going to tell you, we're going to go straight into our breakout session at 9:30. The breakout sessions are: breakout session 1 is legal. It is titled Workers' Comp Fraud, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, presented by Chris Mann, partner of Jones Walker. Breakout session 2 is the tax section. It's PPP, ERC, and other business incentives. It is presented by Brad Tate with Hannah T. Bourgeois. If you all are not aware, Critical Issue will be playing for 90 days after, so if you want to catch one breakout session or another, you can see it later on. And Lauren will be putting up on the website how to achieve this at a later date. So let's begin with our legislative update. And here to moderate and introduce his panel will be Mr. Erich Ponti, LAPA's Executive Director. Erich.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you. We're honored and privileged today to have Representative Jack McFarland, author of the GRID Act, and Mr. Jason DeCuir of Advanced Consulting, tax guru. So we're going to kick off this session jumping right into Representative Jack McFarland to give us an update on what he's up to, the GRID Act, and if you have questions for Representative McFarland, go ahead and post them now. And when Rep. McFarland wraps up, I'm going to go ahead and ask him those questions and forward those questions. And then we'll turn it over to Mr. DeCuir. Rep. McFarland, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks to everyone. Hopefully everyone's doing well. Look, it's been a exciting time for me. We've been traveling for several months now. I'm still meeting with not just legislators, but civic groups, business groups, chambers of commerce, economic development groups, and explaining what we're trying to accomplish here. But one of the big things I want to start with is why I got on board with this. First of all, not just as a legislator, but as a business owner, I have experienced the challenges and the economic losses due to our inability to transport goods from point A to point B. We all talk about how are we going to grow our economy? How do we get businesses here? Look, we better be worried about keeping the businesses we got. And I think that's why this session is so important. Jason can give you a highlight on some other ideas and other things that's going to be proposed as far as tax reforms that concern business and industry. But our proposal is, how do we promote our business and industry by improving our infrastructure? That's where I think that this is such an important session for us. I want to begin too by talking about something at a chairman's meeting that I attended this week with all of our other chairmen, and how Louisiana right now is continuing to be an outlier as compared to our neighboring states. In the last 4 months, Arkansas has increased its gas tax through a sales tax. Now, they already had a higher gas tax per se, but now they've increased it through a sales tax. Mississippi currently in their legislature is looking at a $4.5 billion time project. Not only that, but last year and the year before, they committed their lottery proceeds and their sports wagering to infrastructure improvement. That's why we're getting beat north and east and west in Louisiana when it pertains to infrastructure. Alabama 2 years ago made the same investment. But why is now what I've told everyone, why are we continue to be an outlier? Why do we have to continue to sit back and say, oh, we can't do it right now, it's not a good time? Well, are we any different than Arkansas and Mississippi and Texas? If Arkansas and Mississippi can do it right now, then why can't we? Why can't we say we're going to be committed to changing the way we do business in Louisiana and make that commitment to invest in our infrastructure today? Now, look, it's a big challenge. It's a big ask, but we've put the necessary reforms. That's the only way I committed to getting on board with this. I've worked with Jason and Erich and everyone else to make sure that we had the reforms in there. Reforms that, as you all are aware, some of these reforms have been vetoed. When Neil Abramson was here, he had a proposed package, it was vetoed. Other reforms that never even made it through the legislature because we didn't have a way of funding them. So what we've done is I think we've come up with a perfect package of reform with revenue that will encourage the legislators to not only to vote for, but for us as business owners to get behind it and advocate for it. As I've traveled the state and met with legislators, I've had a great response. I am encouraged. I think we have momentum. I think going into this session, everyone's talking about our opportunities to change the way we do taxes in Louisiana. Look, you see Mississippi's doing it. Look, and I keep going back to it because they're in session right now. And, we keep seeing in the news how they're doing a lot of the things that you're going to see proposed this session. But the one thing they're doing that hasn't got as much attention is they're making an investment in infrastructure. And they're changing the way they spend those dollars. They're doing what we have been proposing for the last 4 or 5 months. So I think it's important that as we move forward, that we recognize that, yes, for growth in our state, it's the time. Erich?
Thank you, Representative McFarland. At this point in time, we don't have any questions posed. We appreciate the update. Jason DeCuir, owner, partner, and advantage consultant will pick up where Rep McFarland update. And Rep, we appreciate the effort, the hard work, the dedication, the time away from your family and your business to turn this state around. And we all thank you and appreciate what you're doing. Mr. DeCuir, do you want to take over and take us down the road with this upcoming and all the reform potential bills that are going to be filed or are filed, and what do you see happening?
Yeah, good morning, Eric. And again, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be among so many friends and great organizations that do so much for the state of Louisiana. So pleased to be here this morning. And then I just want to echo the hard work that Representative Jack McFarland has put in. I mean, I've worked with a lot of legislators, and this guy is relentless. He's been traveling the state. Obviously, we've had all kinds of weather issues and whatnot, but it has not prevented him from going out and getting the job done. And I'll tell you what, there are a lot of people who started off thinking infrastructure improvement and the way that it had to be done wasn't feasible. And as he started making the rounds, people have really begun to understand how important this issue is. In a minute here, I'm going to go into piggybacking off of what Representative McFarland said, a bunch of other reforms that can get Louisiana on track with the rest of the country and make the state more competitive. But the reason these other reforms haven't been done is because we keep putting them off as well. And so the one thing we have to do is stop saying, okay, this isn't the absolute perfect way, or it needs to be done this or that. And eventually we have to do something. And right now is the time on improving our infrastructure, because as we're getting left behind in so many other categories, this is absolutely one area where Louisiana is left behind, and it's going to continue to cripple our economy and our environment in terms of staying competitive. So Representative McFarland, I've appreciated working with you. I know we got a lot more work to do, but we look forward to pushing this reform through. And the thing about this reform is, a lot of people want to talk about, oh, it's increasing this or increase. This is actually reforming the Department of Transportation and Development and taking a lot of existing dollars and ensuring that they're being used for projects and they're not spent on a bunch of other things. And that's the piece that's critical in order for us to be able to move forward. But with that being said, if I am part of the host, Eric, I'm going to attempt to share my screen and pull a presentation up that I will go through with the audience pretty quickly. I believe we have the ability to do that on our end. Let us know, Eric, when you can see our screen here.
We can see it. You're good to go. Come on. Jason, we're good.
Yeah, we're having a little difficulty on our end.
I'm gonna switch. While you figure that out, we did get a question pop in for Rep. McFarland, so I'm gonna go jump back to Rep. McFarland because I know he has another meeting to get to. Rep. McFarland, what type of different oversight of DOTD is proposed in the legislation?
Okay, so one of the first things we want to do is we want to hold DOTD to a different standard. So I've sat on appropriations for 6 years. For 6 years, they walk in, their budget presentation is 2 pages. 2 pages. So it's one of the largest agencies, only behind LDH. And y'all see how many days it takes for us to get through LDH's budget? But yet DOTD comes in and they're gone in 30 minutes. It just doesn't work. So one thing we've done is we are capping DOTD spending at the 5 cents that they're currently spending of the gas tax revenue. Then we're going to force them to come to appropriations. Look, we're not saying they can't have more money, but we're just saying come in here, ask for it, and we take it out of the general fund. That's where it was intended to be taken from to begin with. So for them to have any growth, and they could have, absolutely could have growth. If you can justify it, just like any other agency, you come before appropriations and be held accountable for their spending, be held accountable for your request. Then the audit piece, we've put a piece of an audit in there, and we're going to go in and do just look, the legislative auditor does his audit. We're asking for another audit of any new revenue, including the moving 4 cents of the existing current TTF money over to the transportation subfund to make sure it can't be spent on nothing but roads and bridges. For all of you who don't know, the transportation subfund was a constitutional amendment passed 3 years ago, and it specifically says it can only be used for construction and preservation of roads and bridges. And it also says it cannot be used for employees' cost. Now think about that. Now we have a way to stop government from using dollars that we've intended for infrastructure, for investment, for growth, stop that agency from growing. That audit, when it's completed, it will be presented to a committee, an advisory group, if you want to call it that. That advisory group will take the recommendations from that audit and present it to DOTD, the administration, whoever may be a governor at that time, as well as the legislature for changes in DOTD to make it more efficient.
Representative. Jason, thank you, Representative. Jason, you're good to go if you got it worked out.
Yep, I'm good. So obviously, wanted to mention, as I mentioned earlier, the legislature is looking at tax reform here in this upcoming session. You know, the real unique thing about tax reform in this session is that it's being legislatively driven. I think that's important to note. I've worked on tax reform under a previous governor in different administrations, and typically it's the governor or stakeholder groups driving tax reform. This time it's being driven by legislative leadership, Senate President and the Speaker, as well as the 2 chairs of the tax committee, Senator Brett Alon and Representative Stuart Bishop. And that means that obviously there's going to be a lot more momentum amongst their colleagues because they're the ones doing the driving. It's not like the governor's got to go out and sell the legislature, it's the legislature driving it. So that's why I think this tax reform takes on a much different tone because the legislators are owning it. So what are the things that they are looking at doing this legislative session? Well, one, you probably heard about centralized sales tax collection. The reason you see CA there in parentheses is every one of these items that you see CA would require a constitutional amendment. That's important because that means it requires 2/3 vote on both the House and the Senate side in order for the bill to pass. Now, if it does get out of the legislature, it does not have to go to the governor's desk for signature. It would go straight to the people to vote on. I was asked by the speaker to chair a study group. I'll get into that, and it unanimously recommended that we should go towards a centralized sales tax collection system. Eliminate the federal income tax deduction in lower income rates. The part that requires the constitutional amendment would be to eliminate the federal income tax deduction. Between corporate and individual, and you'll see this in a second, that's about $1 billion. And so that would be more revenue coming in if you eliminated that deduction. However, what they want to do is take that elimination of that deduction and use it to lower our individual income and corporate income tax rate. Get rid of some rates, go down to more of a single rate. The franchise tax, some of you may be subject to this. This is sort of a second tax on corporate taxpayers. It taxes the assets and capital, the stock of your business. It is basically a big billboard up there saying, don't bring your capital and assets to Louisiana because we're going to tax them in addition to your income. Most states have begun to phase this out. Obviously, we used to say we're competing against Texas and Florida, but now Mississippi, as you're watching, has phased out the franchise tax. They're also looking at eliminating the personal income tax. Phasing out the inventory tax. This is another tax that really makes Louisiana uncompetitive. It taxes from the property tax mechanism the inventory in your business. So again, this is one that causes businesses to look at storing their inventory elsewhere or making plans not to bring that type of capital into Louisiana because we have a property tax on the inventory. We did have 100% credit where you get it back, but obviously the legislature has been chipping away at that credit each year. And then industrial property tax exemption, commonly referred to as ITEP. We know that the governor released some executive orders as soon as he took office, kind of upending or changing this program. It now goes to what we call an 80-20. You're not eligible for 100% anymore. But the big thing is that companies now have to go get approvals from local governments. And so you've got to go to the sheriffs, you've got to go to the city council, and you've got to go to the school boards, all three entities, in order to get approval. It used to be you just go to the Board of Commerce and Industry and you were basically done. And now local governments have not really implemented a process to get that approval. So it's kind of created a wild west when you go down to local governments and try to get approval on these projects. And many local governments will tell you, we're just not set up to analyze this stuff. And you're running into a lot of other elements of politics at the local level. The idea would be to streamline that process at the local level if it continues and reform that. And then severance tax reform, not going to get too deep off into that, but I will tell you another place where an outlier is that our oil rates and severance tax is some of the highest in the country. And also we tax oil and gas by different methodologies. We tax oil by value and we tax gas by volume. There's some thought about maybe levelizing that, getting it more of a streamlined, similar taxation system, as well as broadening the base and lowering the rates. And we know how dependent as a state we are on the oil and gas community, which is also taking a beating. So why is the legislature looking at doing this? Well, if you look at this map, you can see what our current tax environment is. This is kind of what they call our business tax climate. If you take all of our different taxes in our structure, how do you rank across the country? And we rank 42nd, and that's 42nd or worse, you know, so that's not a good ranking. You can also see here regionally, as I mentioned, we're competing against Texas and Florida a lot. They're 4 and 11. Mississippi is 10 points higher than us, and they are actually looking to do some new things. They just phased out franchise tax, looking at potentially repealing income tax. But you can also see how we compete both regionally, but we're competing nationally and globally these days. So we've got to improve the system. On the left-hand side of your screen, is how these organizations rank our tax types in these individual taxes. You can see sales tax, we used to be 50th. There's a state now that has a slightly higher sales tax rate than us. Obviously, we don't fare well in individual or corporate, which kind of brings down that overall rate. So as I mentioned, sales tax. Why do we want to centralize our sales tax system? Well, many of you probably know we are one of the last two states, I don't really count our, Alaska, but it's us and Colorado who don't have a centralized system of collection. What does that mean? That you have to deal with local jurisdictions, 58 plus of them, plus the state, and you would have to try to figure out how to comply with almost 60 jurisdictions if you do business across the state of Louisiana. Most states, you just deal with one entity. And so what that is showing on that map is that we don't have a centralized system of collection, nor do we have a uniform base of taxation with state and local government. The reason that this is really coming to play, and I'm not going to get into the tax class on this, but many of you are familiar with the online sales and remote sellers and in a case called Wayfair. And basically what that Supreme Court case said was that you can now collect from online retailers if they don't have bricks and mortar in the state, if they don't have a physical presence, but you have to have a simplified system of sales tax collection such that it doesn't create an undue burden on taxpayers. Well, if you look at our system, and with it being ranked 49th, I think you'd probably agree we don't have a simplified system. What we tried to do is get cute and create a separate remote sales tax collection system just for online sales. You're asking me my legal opinion. I think that it is questionable whether or not we meet the Supreme Court test. So unless we centralize our sales tax system and make it more simplistic, we as a state run the risk of both state and local governments having to return that money back to taxpayers if a suit were filed saying that you're collecting this money in a file of the Supreme Court case in Wayfair. And so that's a lot of why you're hearing that we need to move to a centralized sales tax system. Not going to belabor the point, but these are two other organizations, national organizations that rank how Louisiana fares with its sales tax administration system. I already showed you on the right-hand side, 49th, and then obviously Council on State Taxation gives us a ranking of F. And that is just the perception that makes it difficult to do business in Louisiana. This change is not going to cause any cost to the state whatsoever. In fact, it can be argued that the state and local governments would stand to gain more money through the efficiencies of centralizing our system and allowing for taxpayers to comply with sales tax a lot easier. So what does our system look like today? This is kind of a matrix of what a business has to deal with in our current system. You have to figure out, do I owe state taxes? Okay, well then I go to the Department of Revenue. Well, what if I owe local taxes in in every parish except for Cameron, you are subject to sales tax. Well, then you have to figure out, is it a school board who's my collector? Is it a tax commission? Is it a police jury? Is it the sheriff? Or is it the city government who's my collector? Each one of these could potentially have jurisdiction, and you could potentially have to appeal and pay to each one of these different jurisdictions depending on where you have sales tax. Then if you need an opinion on a sales tax rule from local government, or you want a private letter ruling, or you want to try to enter into a multi-parish audit, you have to go to a different board or entity called the Uniform Local Sales Tax Board. Then obviously, as I mentioned, if you deal with online sales tax or sell online into the state of Louisiana, you may have to deal with the Remote Sales Commission. So we have 4 jurisdictions that oversee sales tax collection when almost all states, as you saw, except us in Colorado, just have one. And that doesn't even account the appeals process. Do I go to the Board of Tax Appeals or District Court if I have an issue? So that's the system we have to clean up. As I mentioned, the speaker created a study group recently that it finished its work in November, and it had all members and stakeholders from across the state. You can see it had legislators, it had business people, but on this next slide, more importantly, it had all the local stakeholders at the table: police jury, municipal, sheriffs, Uniform Local Sales Tax Board, Board of Tax Appeals, Department of Revenue, the School Board Association. And the good news is that that group finally came to the table and who had historically opposed centralizing our sales tax and unanimously agreed that this has to happen. We agreed on a constitutional amendment that would have 3 elements. That's what you're going to see in the speaker's bill. One, that it would create a central system. That doesn't mean it's going to the state or that it's going to local government. It would essentially create a board that would be responsible for handling all these functions. And then that board would be able to collect both state and local taxes. And then, of course, that board would have to be funded. And the thing that I never thought would happen, which did, and it lets you know that local governments now realize we've got to do this, is LSA, LMA, school boards, police jury, and the Department of Revenue all endorsed creating this constitutional amendment. Now, the system would still have to be built, and how that would be done would have to be done statutorily by the legislature, but those details are still being worked on. And I can tell you right now, the biggest fight between revenue and local collectors is obviously the control of the board. But if we get there, that crazy matrix that I showed you earlier would look like this. Finally, that Louisiana business would only have to interface with one single board, and it would handle all of those inherent functions, making Louisiana a lot more competitive. Individual income tax. We're hearing a lot about reform there. I hit this earlier. Basically, what we're looking at doing is repealing the federal income tax deduction and lowering rates. Why do we want to do this? Is, well, Congress's rate basically controlling our budgetary system with income tax. Most of you may not realize, but when Trump cut taxes, Louisianians had a tax increase. Not by us or the legislature raising taxes, but when they lowered federal taxes, that lowered your federal income tax deduction, and it increased the amount that you paid to the state of Louisiana. That's basically how we solved the budget process last time. It generated $400 million to the state coffers. Well, guess what? If Biden comes in and decides to reverse those tax cuts, then Louisiana is going to see less money. We need to get off of that system where Congress is controlling our revenue structure on this tax base, and also get down to maybe a single rate or just 2 rates instead of 2, 4, and 6 at various levels. And the legislature is talking about doing this in a revenue neutral way. So what that means is if you're eliminating $800 million in a deduction, you would lower that rate such that it would be revenue neutral. The state's not losing money, but it's not necessarily increasing money either. And that's how they're looking at doing the reform. They basically want to do the same reform with corporate income tax. The structure is a little more complicated because, as you can see, I don't know why we came up with this. We have a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, and an 8% rate that kicks in at various levels. There's no need for all those rates and levels. But again, you would repeal that federal income tax deduction. That would be a constitutional amendment. And then you would look at getting down to maybe a single rate or just 2 rates of tax to make it easier for taxpayers to comply. As I mentioned earlier, these are the dollars that they're using to look to buy down the rates. Again, you can see the fluctuation between 18 and 19 and 19 and 20 in the individual and corporate income tax. Some of that has to do with the Trump tax cuts coming in, but that's the amount that the federal income tax deduction is worth. Franchise tax. I mentioned that this is a tax on the capital of a company. It's a very complicated tax to administer. We even expanded this tax to LLCs in some cases. And you can see most of the country does not have a capital stock or franchise tax. And Mississippi is in green because they've begun to phase this tax out. What legislative leadership is looking at doing is pairing the reforms in corporate income tax and the reforms in the phase out of franchise tax. Property tax. I've already mentioned that Louisiana has a very harmful inventory in property tax. Again, you can see most states do not have it. We do have somewhat of a credit for property tax, but that credit was reduced to only 75%. And then the legislature came in and said, if you have ITAP contracts, you can no longer get your inventory tax credit refunded to you. So that also began to curtail the credit back to businesses. Then there was another bill that was filed that said if you get so much in your inventory tax credit, you also would not get it refunded. So the legislature has really chipped away at the credit because that comes out of the state budget. But the whole idea is we need to begin to phase the tax out at local government. Then you say, okay, well, property tax goes to local government and that's their revenue. If we phase that out, how are they going to replace it? Well, the thought is now with the industrial tax exemption program and the governor's changes to it, local governments are already getting 20% more than they were on ITEP contracts in their district. And there is some similarity between those parishes who have a lot of inventory and those who also have ITEP contracts. And so there's a thought about the 20% injection of revenue being used to offset the loss of property tax revenue from inventory tax. Texas, it says on this chart that they have an inventory tax, but I will tell you each county has the ability to enact an exemption, and most of them do, to exempt inventory tax from their property tax regime. I talked about severance tax. I'm not going to beat this up, but as I mentioned, our oil and natural gas are taxed by two different methods. One's taxed by value, one's taxed by volume. Dr. Jim Richardson and Dr. Greg Upton did a study on this, and the big issue right now is that this is an industry that's suffering. Oil is taxed at 12.5% and is one of the highest in the country. And so we need to look at getting this industry back into play. And as the environment begins to open up a little bit with COVID, more states are going to be looking at reform to be competitive, such that they'll be drilling in those states first and moving those resources. So with that being said, these are the 7 items that I can tell you that legislative leadership are really looking at pushing. Some of these will have to start on the House side. A couple of them could start on the Senate, but they are making a big push to move these items through the process. And I do believe that several of them have a good chance of making it through the process. I think it's critical that you go back and talk to your tax folks and your tax departments and ensure that they understand some of these changes and get some feedback. I'll be working with legislative leadership and representing many of the business associations and industries. So if you have any questions or concerns about any of these reforms, we'd love to hear from you. I know the legislature is still looking for ideas on how they're going to be able to pay for some of this stuff in a revenue neutral way. So there's still some items out there that I think they're considering putting on the table. So with that, Eric, I'd be glad to answer any questions that may be out there.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, we've got a couple comments and questions. My understanding is this slideshow will be available. This whole presentation will be available for the next 90 days that Lauren will upload. Conclusion of the Critical Issues Summit, and there will be information sent on how to access these slideshows and others. I guess if you have a direct request and cannot pull it through the slideshow, reach out to one of us, and I'll get with Jason if it's all right, Jason, and forward these points on to participants. The constitutional amendment to remove the Fed IT deduction going to the vote of the people. Do you see that going? How likely do you see what kind of educational efforts will take place to inform the public? It's a very complicated issue and to build trust, and I guess that would be on the ballot in October and November. So if you could touch all those elements of educating on all the issues on the constitutional amendments and when it would go to the vote.
Yeah, I can tell you, look, you never want to put the cart before the horse. But two things. I think the reforms to corporate income tax is one of the more likely scenarios that could get out of the Capitol and onto the voter box. Why do I say that? It happened already. It actually went to the voters at the same time Trump was on the presidential ballot. There was not a lot of marketing behind it. There wasn't a big push. And I think anytime you write ballot initiatives and you're not careful how you write them, taxpayers don't know if their taxes are going up or they're going down, and there's confusion. And so I think the point that the questioner is asking is absolutely right, that you have to be able to market this. The people have to understand that the reform is a good reform. Obviously, that it makes it more simple. It's not a tax increase. And so those are all things that have to be worked on. There are groups that are already assembling that want to put some resources behind this in the event that it does get out of the Capitol. I think the individual income tax one is a little bit trickier because you're capturing so many taxpayers in Louisiana, as well as small businesses, pay through the individual income tax. And even though it could be a decrease for all taxpayers, taxpayers still get on the little matrix and look, well, did mine go down as much as another person's? And they look for that percentage of decrease, and you really have some hard debates as those items hit the floor. And I think that's what makes the personal income tax bucket a little bit trickier. But I do think that the corporate one has a great chance, and I do think the individual, the personal one, if done the right way, and the devil is in the details, will be interesting to see if that one is able to get out as well. So those are the comments there, Eric. I want to make sure I answered all the parts of the question.
Thank you. There is a question relating to the GRID Act, relating to how the GRID Act affects the Joint Transportation Committee's responsibility, and it doesn't affect the responsibility of any committee. They still have their oversight. They still do the traveling road show. The legislation will have a audit component, as Representative McFarland referred to, that will take place starting, I believe, in the end of 22. We'll go through 23. Those results will be turned over to an independent panel, the Speaker, the Senate President, Governor, and by the end of September of 24, those recommendations will be made to the Secretary of the Department as recommendations, which would give plenty of time for the Department to enact and also respond or not prior to the 25 session, which is also when the .045 sales tax comes up and all those issues come for debate or discussion. So it does not change any oversight. The citizens of the state will have greater transparency in a website showing all the roads and the bridges updated in real time of where they stand, the status, who got the job's completion, how much it costs, and full transparency in real time updated as well. And all the dollars of the bill, again, as we said yesterday, do go into the lockbox. I don't know if there's any other questions. We're running a little bit of schedule now. If there's any questions related to any of the tax reform issues or anything related to the GRID Act of this upcoming session, Jason and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Jason, we appreciate your in-depth and thorough presentation.
Yeah, and I appreciate Eric again for joining. And just another comment to that last question. The other thing that's going to be critical to keep in mind in order for this to have a chance to pass is that the rate lowering has to be tied to the elimination of the federal income tax deduction. That ensures that the people are not getting voting in, eliminating their deduction, but not knowing that their rate would actually go down. So those two components have to be tied together. I think the legislature knows that, such that if the federal income tax deduction were to pass, then that rate would automatically get kicked in to what's in those bills. But the two have to be intertwined and connected. If not, nobody would vote to just increase their taxes.
Thank you. We did have a question come in, and you may or may not know this, Jason, at this time, session hasn't gone in, but is there an organization group with a strategy that will educate the voting public on these constitutional amendments with the current climate of distrust for government? That's obviously going to be a challenge. And is there a group gauging and informing to be able to take this in that time frame?
So there are a number of groups that I have already had discussions with that are very interested in these reforms and do want to assemble if these constitutional amendments make their way out of the legislature. Again, you know, you don't want to be one of those that's putting the cart before the horse, but you also want to be prepared as these constitutional amendments make it out. As many of you are familiar with PAR, Public Affairs Research, they are one of those groups that is a nonpartisan group that often opines. Many of you get the PAR guide on constitutional amendments. And Robert Travis Scott has done yeoman's work on a lot of these issues. And I know that he wants to begin to be a facilitator for this group. I see a lot of other business groups that are already stepping up to the plate and saying we want to be a part of putting resources together such that the public is educated. And then you have some that are more interested in one item than the other. I can tell you centralized sales tax is the one that I think everybody as a business owner realizes and all stakeholders realize that that's the one that needs to be done. It impacts everybody that collects sales tax. And I think there's the most common consensus around that one in terms of educating the public. Then I think you could have some nuanced groups that might be behind something like inventory or ICAP versus personal income tax and corporate income tax. But there are groups, and if you're interested or are a part of groups, I know there are various associations that are part of this meeting here today. But if you're interested, please reach out as these items make its way through the Capitol, and we'd be glad to plug you in to those discussions and help and educate the voters of this state. Because I know when I go through this presentation, a lot of this stuff is difficult to understand and learn, and it's even more difficult to try to educate the public in sound bites or talking points. So those are all great questions, but there are some planning in process to help with that if they are able to make it out of the legislature.
Thank you, Jason. All right, I'm going to open it up. I know we're running a little ahead of schedule, but I'm going to open it up one last shot. Again, if anybody has any questions on either issue, session starts April 12th, right around the corner. And then it ends on, if I'm not mistaken, June the 10th. So it's a short run. It's a fiscal session. Obviously, these topics that we discussed here today are going to be critical and topic that it is a fiscal session. A lot going on, a lot of updating will come through our associations, through Louisiana Coalition to Fix Our Roads, Grid Act, and all the tax reform issues. So be on the lookout. So if I'm not seeing any other questions, I appreciate everyone's time. Jason, I know you have a busy schedule and carving out your day and time to be with us today, and we appreciate it. We're going to go to a screen that's going to invite you to go to exhibit rooms and our sponsors. So if you take some time over the next little bit and visit, we would appreciate it. And thank you again for your time. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Eric. I explained to them in the very beginning, just before we go to the